the ship. So Tarik has been a long-time friend, collaborator of the cinema before we even opened our doors. He's an electronic musician, a curator, and a DJ, and now based in between Sharjah and Dubai, right?
Yeah. I work for the Sharjah Art Foundation now, which is a lot of fun.
And he's a founding member of Boho Baha, has been involved in organizing a lot of music events here in Bahrain and all over the world, I guess, as well, and here in the UAE before we went on lockdown, and still continues strong somehow. He's been a musician since the age of 9 and plays a variety of instruments. And after years of shuffling between them, he found his true musical love in the electronic world, which is where we crossed paths. The open capabilities of the computer and the synthesizer have pushed him to experiment more and focus on creation. He's constantly finding ways he can use technology to explore new ways to present ideas and experiences to others, and has been involved with a number of institutions, including Boho Baha, Malia Mutek, Radio Al Hara, The Flip Side, and the Red Bull Music Academy, which circles us back into tonight's short film. And I just want to say, CineTalks has been, one of our favorite things that we're doing since we locked down. We're open back at Cinema Aqil now at limited capacity, but this continues to be a way that, really has brought a different dimension, not only in terms of connecting with people that represent our community and, more, far-reaching conversations, but also underrepresented films that, we try to champion at the cinema, but don't necessarily have the programmatic real estate, to always, work with. And I remember, Tarik, we talked about several projects along the way of, things that we wanted to do at the space. So I guess this is the beginning of a series of those. So without further ado, I hand over to your boiler room.
All right. So, this, when we started speaking about this film, this is actually a film that's kind of important to me because while I'm not Bahraini by blood or by birth, Bahrain is definitely my home. I come from a mixed background, and Bahrain was home to me much longer and much more than any place on the planet. So, and Majeed Marhoun is an important part of the modern music history of that island. So I was actually introduced to Majeed Marhoun and his music through Hassan and Hassan's work, both directly and indirectly, that led into this film, because he's done a lot of things that deal with Majeed Marhoun's work. His musical encyclopedia, there was his work at the Venice Biennale. It's an incredible story. I love music stories in general, but I have to say that Majeed's story is a really, really unique one. And so I'm actually going to hand it over to Hassan to introduce himself a little bit, and tell us a little bit about his background and Majeed.
All right. Thanks, Tarik, for the introduction. It was really nice. I want to keep this one a little brief because I really want Saleh to get a chance to speak about the film in particular, just because in the project we did in 2016, I feel like speaking about the film, or the film itself, was one of those outputs that I think deserved a lot more attention, a lot more discussion than it actually got. But I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. Majeed Marhoun, I'll just jump into it. I don't want to introduce myself so much, but my name's Hassan. I'm a composer and artist from Bahrain. And in 2016, we did this project called Symphonies of the Self, which is also the title of the documentary that we're going to be talking about. The project, Majeed Marhoun, this composer, he's possibly, as far as I know, the first classical music composer in the Gulf, from the Gulf. And his story, the way he learned composition, or the way he became a composer, is quite unusual. It's quite something. I think it's very telling of kind of the social, political history of the region, and it's just kind of something that we acknowledge in our past, And basically in the Majeed Marhoon was born in 1945 to a not very wealthy family, to a rather poor family actually, and he had a very difficult upbringing. So at the age of 15, he had to drop out of school, join BAPCO, which is the Bahrain Petroleum Company, to support his family, but his mother and his brother, but his father was already out of the picture by that time. And so when he was 15 and he starts making an income from working at the petroleum company, he saved half his salary each month because he wanted to buy a saxophone. He had heard about the saxophone on Aramco radio, which is another petroleum connection from Saudi Arabia. We can hear it in Bahrain because it's so close. And so he was obsessed with this instrument. He wanted to learn how to play it. So he saved some money and he eventually bought a saxophone and taught himself to somebody had gone to Cairo, I believe, to buy the saxophone for him. So he ordered the instrument from Cairo because we didn't have any musical instrument shops at the time, in the 60s. And so at any rate, in the 60s, it was a very active time socially, politically, economically, for many different reasons, in the region as a whole, but in Bahrain. So there was this independence movement happening at the time, and Majeed was part of it. It was something, that a lot of the intellectuals, a lot of the artists were involved in, and Majeed was part of the independence movement. And he was arrested for his activities in the independence movement, and he was put he was handed a life sentence in Bahrain, which is about 22 years he spent in Bahrain prison. But most of the time in prison he spent on a penal colony on an island off the coast of the mainland called Jeddah, which is kind of between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. I think the Saudi bridge, the Bahrain and Saudi bridge, right now it literally passes through it today, but back then there was no bridge. And so Majeed, when while he was in prison, he decided that he wants to study the music of Beethoven, and he starts to compose. He starts to study only the music of Beethoven, mostly for 22 years, and he starts to compose music in the style of Beethoven, mostly as a self-independent research project. And over time, some of his friends who were also artists, intellectuals, many of whom moved to Europe afterwards to become researchers, writers, professors in universities, they carried his music scores with them. They smuggled his scores actually to orchestras in Europe. And in 1981, there was this orchestra in East Berlin, one of the radio orchestras in East Berlin, which is it was based on where the Funk House is right now in Berlin. It's one of those important radio studio locations. They recorded 2 pieces of music on this album, and they smuggled the album back to Bahrain. So one of our earliest history of contraband music was actually classical music. It's just beautiful classical music, and it's not. And the funny thing about the music, and I'll just kind of end it here, was that it was very disconnected from kind of the classical music movements that were happening in Europe in the 70s and 80s. There was this whole new music, contemporary music movement, but Majeed Marhoon was so disconnected from that, and all he was doing was copying Beethoven, trying to emulate Beethoven. And in 1990, he left prison, and he started becoming a teacher to many people in music. He was always around socially. I used to see him play the saxophone in the Menama Public Library. So in the public library, everyone's studying. We'd have this guy chain smoking and playing the saxophone every day. I mean, this was kind of my earliest childhood memories of a public library. And he passed away in 2010 after a lot of interesting activities. And so 2016, I'd approached Red Bull in Bahrain, the team, to see if they would potentially sponsor or help support this project that I wanted to do about Majeed Marhoon. And so Saleh was on board. And the project it involved a 2-night concert of some of Majeed Marhoon's music, where we got together the orchestra and some of Majeed's closest friends. And we also invited from Norway, Buke Wesseltoft, who's a well-known jazz pianist, jazz keyboardist, and Henrik Schwartz, who is a German kind of electronic dance music producer. And the reason we invited them was Majeed Marhoon, in his last letter to one of his students, one of his copyists, a young man who used to type up his music score on the computer after Majeed had written it by hand, he had said that he believes this was the last letter before he passed away in 2010. He wrote that I believe that musicians in the Middle East, kind of in the Arab-speaking world, if they want to get into music and they want to be part of the conversation of contemporary classical music, they're going to need to acknowledge and accept electronic music or electronic computer music as part of the language of classical music. So even classical music is not what Beethoven did. Despite Majeed's music, he believes that classical music and all forms of music, they evolve over time, and it's important to remain kind of connected to everything that's going on. And so we did the concert, and then we did. I personally did some other projects afterwards, but part of the project of Symphonies itself was the documentary, which is where Saleh comes in. And I'll just hand it over to Saleh. That's okay.
Thank you, Hassan. So, hi everyone. My name is Saleh Nas. I'm a filmmaker from Bahrain. I'll be very honest. When Hassan first approached me for this project, I had no clue who he was talking about, which was a bit sad. Someone of that stature should have a statue up on a square somewhere, but maybe that's a little bit controversial. When he told me about this documentary, I said, yeah, sure, let me hear the music. But he said, no, before you hear the music, I need to tell you about him. And as Hassan so casually pointed out, for most of the years that Majeed was composing his pieces and learning how to write a symphony, he was incarcerated for most of those years, and he only came out much, much, much later. And his genius was recognized in some way, as you can see from the documentary. Now, let me just let it out. The documentary was supposed to feature a lot of what Hassan just said about Majeed's story. And we had all these sequences planned, recreations of the cell where he used to listen to Beethoven every night. I think it was Radio Aramco, right? Or was that earlier?
That was a bit, I think, when he was younger. So
right.
He didn't have access to radio.
To radio.
Or even musical instruments while he was away. So he had to kind of write it
everything down by notation. So I was struck by just how amazing this story was, especially if you factor in his background, his education level. He was brought up, he was born in a barasti, like a house made out of palm leaves. And he used to joke, the hottest day of the year. I was born on the hottest day of the year.
A day after the bombing in Hiroshima,
exactly.
So kind of connects that World War II
to his birth.
Yeah, it's really strange.
And his kind of almost I wouldn't say rags to riches, but rags to riches in the musical sense of not knowing anything, but that insane drive to learn music at school. Through a friendly music teacher, to work on himself, to better himself constantly, and to learn musical instruments. He started, I think, if correct me if I'm wrong, Hassan, the first kind of jazz band during the Ashura processions here in Bahrain.
It was So that's right. That's right. He also
was actually going to bring that up later on. The band is still around, no? In fact, I think there's a couple of shoots of the band.
Yes.
The band played yesterday. Yeah, they did.
Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to bring up, is Ashura was just like a few days ago. And that's actually one of my really fond memories of Bahrain, was seeing that band play. My friends would always bring me down to Manama, and then, we'd always go looking for the brass band. That was like the goal every single time.
Yeah, it's the most fun part. So that's his legacy, right? And so I was so taken by the story that I said, Hassan, okay, I'm on board, whatever. Let's do it. So we started just doing some initial bits of research about the documentary, and since it was, for me, working with Red Bull as a client, it was supposed to have all these reenactments. It's supposed to look cool and pay tribute to the life of this man who we were supposed to sort of rejuvenate or make people remember his legacy on film. And a key person to all of that was, first Hassan, which you probably recognize from the documentary because his face is in it, and he talks about a few things in there. And then the second person is the late Salman Zaman, who passed away only a couple of weeks ago, unfortunately. And he was sort of the gatekeeper to all that was Marhoon, because he was his close friend. He documented his life. Without Salman Zaman's sort of friendship, we wouldn't have had any of the footage that we had of Marhoon. We wouldn't have had access to photographs or even the trust of the family for us to be able to at least say a little bit about his life. Now, what I'm going to say is that having wanted to make this bit a little bit more wholesome and so that you know about his life, about his incarceration in prison and all of that, on the first day of filming, we got a message saying, stop filming. We can't say his full story. We can't say basically that he was incarcerated. So I was left.
I mean, sorry, just for cutting you off. The thing is, like, the issue was this was something from the 60s, and so it's so different. The circumstances. So for us, we couldn't understand why this would be an issue. It's got to do with more like pre-independence history. It's not.
Yeah, it's not anything to do with anything current. And he was, given a medal by the king and everything. So he was legit. So we're wondering why. But so in these kind of things, what I was telling Hassan earlier is that you're working for a client, and basically the project was going to be pulled from the whole repertoire. So it was just going to be a concert, and I had a little sit down and I thought, and I said, I called Hassan up and I said, listen, we'll say a little bit about his life. We won't mention the stuff they don't want us to mention. But we have to turn it around somewhere. And that's why the documentary takes the form it does today. It's shorter, and its focus really is about the concert, about the efforts, about the music mostly, and about the stuff that happened during the concert. And that's why I think the people who know of Marhoon's story were sort of asking questions. Why would you do a documentary without saying everything? And the people who didn't, I guess they just enjoyed the music. But you had to balance it. Because for me...
Yeah, but by having this out in the first place, people are going to start. We were hoping that people would go and do their own research.
Exactly. At least something there. I mean, the whole goal was to kind of remember him, remember his music, and make sure there's access to his pieces. And his pieces are, I think, very well. We were humming it for months in the office after the documentary. They're simple, and yet, I mean, what moved me was they're very sad, really. There's a sadness in them that kind of took me when listening to them. And really, as a person who's our first Western composer, Western style composer, it's a very important part of history, artistic history, musical history. No matter how you feel about it, it's something that should have been remembered and should be remembered, and I hope at least we threw some light on that through our documentary.
Yeah, absolutely. But we had room for. I mean, another thing is, looking at the documentary itself, Saleh, I have actually a few questions for you. One of the issues is I must also say that the context of presenting this documentary was within the context of the concert almost, So
yes,
people who would come to the concert at first there's this stage and there's this projection of the documentary itself, and then the concert begins, So for us, the documentary had the second life as. So this documentary it seems like it's having several lives right now. It's at first it was just like a short documentary clip that you would see on a concert stage, but then it was available online. It was made available online, so people could see it online. So the context.
We had two versions. Okay. The shorter one that we showed before a pre-concert, and then the stuff we added later after the concert.
Right. That's right. That was also, the context kept changing. And recently, when Salman Zaman passed away, Majeed's gatekeeper, his friend, passed away. The documentary had a third life. It was like, did you notice this, Saleh? Like people using a lot of the images that you use.
Yes. They take screen grabs from it.
Yeah. So these screen grabs. So it became. It had this. It was kind of. It's unfortunate that it's associated with the passing of someone else, but it's just this thing that had multiple lives as a documentary. And so in my mind, the documentary it's not just 15 minutes long. It's hours and hours, years long. It's because of all the backstories and all the the conversations we had, the preparation and what happened afterwards.
But it was done in a very short period of time, Hassan, if you remember.
Yeah, I think we gave you something like 3 weeks to do it or something.
Wild. Yeah, it was something like that.
Yeah, it was really tough.
It was quick.
Yeah.
We had to think on our feet. And I mean, one thing I'd like to add about Salman Zaman, Allah Rahma, he was very protective over Marhoon's legacy. When trying to pry out information from him, I'd have to ask the question 3 or 4 times until he kind of got it and would give me a little bit more of what I wanted when I was interviewing him. And seeing his dedication to Marhoon in that way, I don't know if I told you this, it was very important for me once we had the first cut of the film. I took Salman to my car, and we sat down, and I had a DVD burned and I stuck it in the CD player of the car. There's a little screen, and I played it for him in the car because we're talking 2016. I don't think all the internet stuff was that fast.
Really early 2016,
yeah. And he sat there and he watched it in silence. And then by the time he's done, because I kind of wanted that validation from him. If I didn't have Salman's validation after yours, I probably didn't do a good job. But then the credits rolled and the final piece kind of the music, and then he kind of looked at it for a bit. Then he looked at me with a tear in his eye, and he said, "It's good." And then he kind of left the car. I mean, it was his way of saying he loved it.
Yeah, but I had so many similar kind of experiences during that process, and I think the issue is like we are talking to this kind of iconic musician in Bahrain, Salman Zaman, who was friends of Majeed, and he. But we were talking about 2 different people at the same time. We were talking to him about one of his closest friends. Majeed was a really good friend of his, just on a personal level. But we also talked about Majeed, the artist, the composer. This idea we have of what a composer is and what an artist is. Is so different. They sometimes feel like we're talking about 2 different people, and I think it was really important to balance out this idea that the composer and the friend are the same person to Salman Zaman. And so every time I look back at this documentary, I specifically keep asking myself, did we do this right? And I the more I think about it, I think yes. I mean, there was this sense that we're trying to kind of remember this person, who had a life and had a family and had friends and influenced a lot of people. But we also we're kind of relearning this. We're also being introduced to this person for the first time, even though he'd been around. So it's this double kind of introduction to this.
And we should know about people like Marhoon.
We should.
Because in Bahrain, it's very easy to kind of live in a bubble and think that you're the only artist that ever was and ever will be. And, when you see the legacy of people that came before you, that no one appreciated or talked about, let's face it.
I think you're right. I agree with that. And I think, I wouldn't call it like kind of a lineage or like the genesis of your own lineage as an artist, but because, I'm technically trained as a composer as well, and so, but I don't see myself as being part of Majeed's school of music.
No.
But I acknowledge it, and I understand kind of what went into it, and and it's almost a duty to me to really understand what comes, what else comes out. And after this Majeed Marhoon project, I started thinking again about music in the region, not just in the Gulf, but beyond the Gulf as well. And I think it's quite, it's this idea of looking at these heroes almost, these icons, but seeing them as both human, people who lived, but also understanding that their contributions were important. So,
I mean, for me, I would say ever since the Marhoon project, music followed me around, really. A lot of the projects that I would work on were music projects. When we did the concerts for Ala Ghawas, I did a few music videos for Sami Yusuf. I've taken up instruments as an amateur musician. So I don't know, maybe like in death, he's following me around, like his legacy of just
at the
music and to kind of.
It's funny. It's funny you bring up death, because like at the concert, like on both nights after the concert was over, so people had seen the documentary. They went through this. I don't know how long was the like a 2-hour music set. It was quite long, and at the end of the concert on both nights, Majeed Marhoon's widow came on stage. So Majeed had married after he was released, and he had a son, and so his widow and his son came on stage, and Majeed's widow on both nights told me that she was convinced that Majeed's spirit was on the stage right next to us. And one of the things we wanted to do throughout the concert was have an empty chair with a saxophone on it to like symbolize
acknowledge his place.
Yeah, so we were kind of it's this balance. But Saleh, I also wanted to add one more thing, and I don't know if this is of interest to the listeners here when it comes to the usage or the contextualization of music documentaries. But in the case of Bahrain, I don't know if you've noticed this, Saleh, or not, but ever since that concert, it's almost become like standard practice by a lot of older musicians in Bahrain when they do the celebratory kind of concerts to start with some kind of a documentary film that really.
Yes,
that's true. It's like an emulation of what you've done. So
there were 2 concerts like that. I think that had a documentary.
There was Khalid al-Sheikh, and there was what's his name, Khan, Wahid al-Khan. So like both concerts, and both of these concerts,
they followed the same format.
It was the same format, but to me it was just strange to see that happen, because I'm like, all right, they're doing it. But in the concerts that I've seen, they were not 15 minutes long; they were 45 minutes long, and they ended up being really.
It's a bit intense.
It is. It's kind of, but it turns into like this constant praise thing.
Pat on the back.
It was a self pat on the back, and it was bizarre, And the way we did it was we wanted to be as as
short and sweet.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of easy to fall into that trap a little bit, where you want to add context to a performance, but at the same time, I don't know. I think I could see how a lot of people would just sort of get really, really wrapped up in creating a mythos instead, rather than actually providing some context. I mean, with the Majeed Marhoon concert, Symphonies the Self, that context is really important, and I think a lot of people absolutely needed that going in, and you guys did a great job of kind of balancing things and keeping it concise and to the point, whereas I could see how a lot of other people would get too caught up in minutia and just
I mean, I don't mind all of that. I would say that if people are celebrating music and local artists, whether they're older or younger or whatever, then that's the point. Then we did our job. It doesn't matter, if it's not to our liking, it definitely serves an audience. There is an audience for that. Fine. Maybe it's not the way we like it now. It'll change in the future, because you start the ball rolling. People, they become more savvy, when it comes to these kind of things, and they won't accept a 45-minute documentary after a while.
It's way too much.
With music, that's the thing. It's not just music. It's a history of a culture. It's a record of culture now.
Yeah, it's a record of society as a whole as well.
And I think when you start having music that's stagnant, that doesn't pay any tribute to what's gone in the past, say historically or through culture, or like Arabic music or Persian music or Moroccan music or whatever, that just is sort of like, say it's a mimic from the West, for example, and there's a stagnancy in the music. It's just the same. That's why.
But this is why curatorial, like this notion of like curatorial contextualization and this ability to kind of recontextualize and kind of so that a piece of work, whether it's music or cinema or a documentary even, it's, I mean, here we are nearly 5 years later, we're talking about this documentary, and like I wouldn't have guessed that 4 or 5 years later, in the middle of the pandemic, I'd be sitting down and talking to you about
with a fake background.
Yeah, what are you talking about? It's real, and
we're in cinema.
And so, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's these works have multiple lives, like I said earlier. Like it's, where you have a documentary on, even though it's a 15-minute kind of snippet, it wasn't fair. It wasn't completely fair to you as a director, as a filmmaker, to kind of have to
push everything in.
Compromise, is that the right word? Like to compromise or to?
Yeah, I did compromise. No, I didn't compromise. Like we put all the effort that we could in the time frame that was available. But right. Yeah, it's a compromise.
Yeah, on some level it is, and but I still think a work like that, still is important. I mean, for me as someone from Bahrain, thinking back, and I constantly work with this idea of music from here, and it's really important to me. It's one of those things that I think will, the future will have another life, another value that I don't.
I for one would love to revisit his story at some point.
We should
and do a feature length.
If anybody listening has the
money to fund such a project, now is the time.
Project.
But I think it. I mean, the reason I say that is because I think it fits in really well with the kind of notation project that you're doing. That's
so right now
that you got the fund for.
Yeah, so Majeed Marhoon has about 120 completed compositions, like orchestral compositions, but we've only heard about 10 of them in his life, in total. So there's about 100, give or take, 100 works that
missing music.
And they're not missing. They're all handwritten and they're stored in a folder in his.
But they're missing, audibly missing or already.
Yeah, so
missing.
I've been working with a team to type up all 120 compositions, and we want to have them copyrighted, and the ownership goes to his family, so that every time an orchestra or somebody would play the music, they would get copyrights for it. And so this is one of the things that I'm working on, but it's gotten a bit complicated with Salman Zeyman's passing, but I think we're going to continue doing it, and we're going to keep it's complicated that way because the legalities, or maybe the copyright laws rather, are just so complex here. So it's just taking a bit longer than it should. But
Hassan, could you also tell us a little bit about Majeed's musical encyclopedia?
Yeah, so one of the things he did, Majeed Marhoon, while he was in, he started it in the 70s while he was in prison, but he completed it just a few years before he passed away. It was like a 6,000-page music dictionary. It's like, or an encyclopedia rather. It's a music encyclopedia like nothing else. It's written in Arabic, which in itself is worth something because there's very little Arabic music encyclopedias, like technical encyclopedias that discuss musical terminology. But it's quite interesting because it mixes like folk music from Japan and Bahrain to like classical Western music ideas and electronic music ideas and everything written in Arabic. But it's, like I said, it's 6,000 pages written by hand. And a few years ago, back in 2017, so just after we finished the project, they completely, this institution in Bahrain called the Sheikh Ibrahim Center, they printed out, they had someone type up and print out this encyclopedia into 9 volumes. So if you have it, it's like those Encyclopedia Britannica style dictionaries or encyclopedias and a lot of people have. I have them on my shelf somewhere, but it's just an incredible resource. But,
and they were still printing them, Hassan, while we were doing the project. I think
we were
few more volumes.
And it's finished now. They completed it a year after the concert. Yeah.
And actually, Tarik Hassan's piece from the beginning of the concert uses elements of the dictionary in a sort of electronic way to.
Yeah. So in the opening, the opening performance was like, I just got on stage alone with the laptop, and I kind of played back the first recording from the first smuggled piece of music by Marhoon, and I manipulated with electronics, and I had text from this encyclopedia, reading back sections of like the avant-garde or electronic music or contemporary music, and it's kind of Majeed Marhoon's take on this stuff. But that was just my performance. A lot of people didn't get it, but
I got it.
Yeah, but for me it was a way to converse with, kind of bring him up to speed with, conversation that I'm interested in today. So.
Do you know what I thought about his music when I first heard it? Yes, it was sad, but it was quite cinematic.
I agree. It is, because it's very emotional, and this is, Saleh, we really should consider doing a second part of this documentary, like specifically.
No. We'll do a whole new one.
I'm like obsessed right now.
Through the generous donations from the people that are listening in today.
But yeah, there are some physical kind of behavioral things in the music notation that I've noticed. Like, for example, he uses arpeggios, which is like a thing that Beethoven was really famous for using, like with his orchestral arrangements. An arpeggio is like repetitive music, not in a chord, not a vertical kind of collection of notes all at once, but they're spread out evenly over time. It's like bum, 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 bum. It's like it just keeps going on.
Like the piece that's in the documentary.
Yeah, exactly. He uses that a lot. But if you really look at the music score itself, I always, and this is kind of a theory that I have, I don't know if anybody agrees with me, but it goes up and down like a wave, like the ocean, like this. So I always think like that's the view that he had on this island, and so like nice. The landscape of the island, that particular island, it's like that's where the arpeggios come from. But this is kind of just a theory that I have. Maybe I'm just.
But they also use if you look at things like Downton Abbey, the beginning of the credits, it's the same thing.
That's right.
Arpeggio or whatever you call it.
Arpeggios, yeah, that's right. Music
right.
And cinema. It's quite interesting. Wow.
Yeah, they have a history.
They do, don't they?
So can I jump in, because I'm kind of
Absolutely.
listening to. I guess I'm going to start with you, because this is not meant to be a Q&A, but you've been talking to me about this project, and you've been kind of immersed in in the Bahrain scene, and Hassan really well, and and Saleh's work, and you've kind of also in a way entered the sort of Bahrain scene with like an element of sort of outsider curio, right? But that sort of connection with with the country, and being part Saudi and so on, and you went to kind of unearth I guess the discoveries of what the scene was like, but also these musicians, these sorts. How have you kind of engaged with that in your work, and
so
frustration that comes with watching a film like this and just feeling like, oh my God, like there's so much we can do, and there should be bodies of work that that are created, and there should be more electronic music engagement. There should be like on all sort of layers of musicality of this work. Like how are you kind of wrapping your head around that?
To be honest, pretty much everything you said applies. For me, it was a big shock. Again, like this is like Bahrain is a place that I feel really connected to as home, and so it's when you live on an island, it's easy to feel like you've seen everything and everything that's there, I think it was Saleh who mentioned that, you feel like you're in this bubble. And then to kind of be shown this incredible thing, with this incredible story that you didn't even know existed, it's shocking. I remember when Hassan introduced me to the project and what was happening, and he told me the story about Majeed Marhoun. I was like, I can't believe this. And then when he mentioned about the brass bands specifically, these were things that I had experienced, and his music had found its way into my life somehow, and I didn't even know that it was him. His legacy was there and it's present, and I almost felt kind of ashamed that I hadn't dug deeper, and that somebody had to tell me about it. But I was really thankful for that at the same time. So, yeah, this Majeed Marhoun story is probably one of my favorite musical stories out there. It's just, and I think another thing that was not really mentioned is that he was going deaf. He
was deaf by the end of his life. He was completely deaf.
Yeah,
I think that's probably Beethoven. That's Beethoven, right?
Another Beethoven.
But that's why in the documentary he goes, "What?" And someone goes saying, "Can you just play us something?" And he asks him 5 times.
But yeah, no, it's just wild. And actually, since I've left Bahrain and moved to Dubai, I've been introduced to more and more music that's really surprised me from Bahrain. Stuff that was electronic and interesting. There's this band called I think they're called the Bahrain Trio Band. Their music is so hard to track down, but they were doing really cool sounding sort of psyche pop stuff with synthesizers, and it was really, really interesting music.
What year was that? What year was what?
I can't tell you offhand. If I had to guess, 70s.
This was in the early 70s, maybe even late 60s. They started in the late 60s, early 70s.
Oh yeah, and then there's a couple of bands that I knew about that were a bit more modern. Everybody in Bahrain knows Ali Bahar.
Yeah, another person who needs a statue somewhere in a park.
Yeah, and then there was the Osiris prog rock legends. That was one of my first introductions.
Actually, that trio that you mentioned. That trio that you mentioned thought of some of the members are from Osiris, so it has a connection to Osiris.
No way.
Yeah, Osiris started as a fun.
We need to talk about this afterwards because I've been trying to track down some good copies.
They also did disco for a while. Yeah, it's weird. There's a lot of stuff.
All right, this needs to be a continuing conversation. Yeah, I would love to hear some Bahraini disco. That would actually make my month.
To me, I guess this is part of the sort of the almost devastation and infatuation with this, with this idea, right? Since Saleh told me about the project, and since you've been talking about, I didn't really know much about Majeed Marhoun. I just knew that he was, a musician. But the thing that strikes me about this, and I guess it's part of the erasure that you talk about, in the making of the film, and you did the best you can with what you have in a way. But that tends to be the story of a lot of these these people and a lot of these artists that occupied a very important historical and political moment in telling the narrative of the Gulf that we think of as today, and we just don't have any repository that is accessible to tap into. I'm thinking of the work of Nujum al-Ghanem, for example, that she recently made a film about the late Hassan Sharif, the artist who which also it still skates the sort of the political and the social in some ways in her, and that has a lot to do with her style as well. But she does touch on some very important aspects of what he represented, and a lot of that in terms of our memory, or even in terms of collective memory, around Gulfi political activism, at the cusp of independence, that Majeed Marhoon himself was reading the works of Gorky and and George Hanna, and was a leftist, and there was a whole subset. And and Hassan, you mentioned it a little bit, but in passing, like the sort of the brain drain almost of that intelligentsia that that departed. And I think it's a recurring story across the Gulf as well, that that we just don't have a lot of material to contend with.
The material is there, but you really have to dig for it. It requires.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. Like in terms of placing it in the hands or eyes or the even the books of.
But at the same time, it's tricky, because being able to just like Saleh, like this ability to be able just to tell a story, like, are you able to tell a story in its completion? You can't, sometimes you can, but you have to twist things. You have to soften the language. You have to play with the narrative. It's bizarre. And but there's this other thing that you also have to kind of tackle with, and I think it's just like the question you asked Tarik earlier just got me thinking about if you're an outsider living in this place where interesting things are happening, and would you be able to engage with it or use it somehow? And it's strange, just to balance out this idea of ownership, appropriation, to do something tastefully without kind of just appropriating something completely and turning it into something else. And how do you do something? How do you balance things out ethically and artistically and creatively? Like it's a very fine line, to kind of find some kind of semblance,
find the line of like paying homage to something rather than fetishizing it. It's really, really difficult, and especially like it's something that I noticed a little bit of in Bahrain. Even like there was a lot of like Westerners that would sort of fetishize Arabic culture, and it would make me feel very, very uncomfortable.
I mean, Orientalism is part of what we have to deal with all the time. It's just, and but even within music, like there are people who I'm not going to give any names specifically, but there are like these DJs and collectors who've made a name for themselves by going and tracking obscure records from around the Arab-speaking world and presenting it like a finding, like a discovery, as if it's weird. How do you present it as something interesting, but without appropriating, without kind of being orientalizing as well? It's a really fine line between.
It's a very, very, very fine line, to be perfectly honest. I mean, there's definitely ways to ethically do it, and there's a lot of people that. So the easy thing to do is to exploit it, and there's a lot of people that definitely do that. And I think, like, especially like musically, internationally, right now, we're seeing a major resurgence in that type of DJ. Actually, we're getting into I think it's actually been a backlash of living in a Spotify world. We've got access to basically any kind of music that we can get our hands on. That the people that are going out and tracking down the records, the ones that are starting to get some popularity, and so as a result, I think there's a lot of like.
This is why I think Saleh's documentary is actually important, because the reason I say this is because things like Spotify, Tarik, and this ease of getting access to things, like access to infinite, entertainment or media, it comes at a price of like erasing context, So, like Majeed Marhoon's music, for example, if you were to go on SoundCloud or, you cannot find it on. It's not on Spotify. But even if it was, I'm pretty sure that whole story, the context and the explanation, the metadata and the contextualization of where the music comes from, why it's important, that stuff doesn't exist in something like Spotify. And so these kinds of music documentaries, and I think what Saleh did is one of those. It's kind of, at least in the region, like here in the Gulf, we don't have enough of that. And I think this is one of those things that I not just because I'm personally invested in music, but it's just something that I think is important, and it's something that's, because it's not just about music. It's really about society. It's about history. It's about, like, Ruthayna, what you were saying about how we don't have access, or we don't have knowledge. We don't have, how can we tap into all these repositories of histories? This is kind of what we're struggling with. This is not just a Bahrain thing. I think this is more of a regional thing.
I think music is the first entry point into any people's or nation's culture, full stop. Before art, before movies, before anything. Maybe movies, but I'm biased.
But also beyond that, I mean, I think, in terms of like exploration or understanding of a culture is also, the idea of, music or, storytelling or documentary filmmaking specifically as political acts as well, Those, you mentioned, Aramco World, and you mentioned, I mean, even I think, partners in making this documentary are sort of state-sanctioned, organizations or funders that, that ultimately will tell a particular, story about what you're supposed to think of when you think of a, almost like a valorization of like certain characters that represent the idealist image of, of your chosen artists, of your representative artists. And you mentioned the 45-minute documentary of, of sort of the usual suspects, that you think of as, let's think of like Bahraini music today, and I'm wondering, like, whether that vacuum is also intentional, by design. I mean, there's some institutional, infrastructural in being able to fund those projects. I think there's a global funding project kind of challenge with interest in MENA, documentary filmmaker that excludes kind of the Gulf experience, as sort of unfamiliar and sometimes, benign, or flat, because you don't really understand the sort of, whether it's, there's no exposure or even telling, of the, whether it's, ethnic kind of, stratification. I mean, everybody talks about sectarian tensions, when there's, especially, if we're looking at the contemporary trajectory of Bahrain, that's sort of the headline, polarization or binary that it's positioned in. But there's a much deeper, much richer story that through the specificity of music of a certain time can really capture so much more texture. I mean, just even in this conversation, the things that we've painted on top of this documentary, from the imprisonment story, from the British protectorate status of of the country, to smuggling records, to I mean, you look at a film like Searching for Sugar Man, Malik bin Jindul's film, like that's a film that was created out of that kind of I guess giving importance, and attributing importance to an untold story, that tells you much more about racial tensions, about class struggles, about the music industry, and the pure musical genius, that he represented, that Rodriguez represented. So, to me, it's like, where are our, who's telling those stories?
I think the irony of like say for example other Arab filmmakers that are not based in the Gulf, the irony is that they'd get their funding from their past colonial masters almost, and they'd be allowed to make those documentaries about their heroes or whatever. Like we were talking about trances the other day and things like that, the interesting musical documentaries. The sad thing is in the Gulf we don't qualify for a lot of these funds in order for us to be able to tell those stories. And within our own society or cultural institutions, we don't have access to that. So a lot of the documentaries are made from people's own efforts. Sometimes they're not qualified filmmakers, so you'd find small like documentary made out of PowerPoint slides or something like that. And I don't think that there aren't people wanting to say the stories. I think they just don't know where to start or don't have the means to do it. I mean, we were so lucky to have Red Bull and Hassan, pushing for a project such as Marhoon's, without which we've never seen the light. I wouldn't have heard of him if Hassan hasn't come with this project. So we can't underestimate sometimes these institutions, even if there's like this kind of political undertone or all the stuff that you were talking about with Aina, but the reality is we need institutions like that to be able to enable filmmakers, artists, musicians, whatever, to be able to speak about that. And that's why sometimes I think, especially in the beginning, we shouldn't rock the boat too much, because we need those institutions for us to be able to at least
that's exactly
start a dialogue.
That's exactly my frustration with this, is that we're kind of at the mercy of these corporate institutions that decided to set up to fill the gap almost of what would be in other structures a part and parcel of cultural development
and that's why we have to be a little bit smarter as filmmakers and as musicians to be able to push a little bit, just a little bit, and then try again within something else, push a little bit more, and then come back and revisit. Things happen slowly.
This is why we have extensions like this. I mean, to me, this is what the film is the film, and and I think everybody should watch it, and it is, like you said, a good starting point. And I'm so happy to hear that there's this kind of renewed curiosity or wanting to engage with the subject amongst you. But I think it's also it is that it's the extensions and the special features that always have to accompany any story from this particular geopolitical space that we occupy.
I just think in order for us to be able to reach the right audience, why was Marhoon so successful? Because someone like Boogie or forgot the other guy's name, sorry, came to Bahrain. Henrik Schwartz. Yes,
yeah, sorry. A lot of people in the audience.
It's been 4 years. I forgot the name.
But a lot of people in the audience came specifically to see them because they were surprised to see them.
Yeah, they're superstars in their field, I think. But what I was trying to say is that
not small and not bougie.
I mean, look, it's first of all, it's sad that we need to look for outside validation for us to appreciate Marhoon's work. Although I love the cross-cultural, fertilization of work and stuff like that. I like that kind of stuff, but at the same time, we kind of needed them to come and say, look, this guy's good, for us to say, oh, yeah, he is good. But I think Marhoon's work speaks for itself when you listen to it, if you just give it a chance. Other pop music or something, I don't think travels that well, but when they come and listen to traditional music such as the pearl diving music or the traditional music of the area, somehow they reconnect because you're building up on thousands of years of knowledge and music and musicality and all those kind of things.
I mean, one could argue that's also an Orientalist, kind of engagement, with the region, right? Like there's sort of infatuation with resurrection.
I mean, at this point, someone has to engage with the music. If we are not, why not someone else?
That's a very long conversation. I guess so, with infinite funding at your disposal and all these structural challenges addressed and political censorship aside, what are the projects that you would want to see kind of given the light of day?
I'd make a biopic of Marhoon's life, seriously, like a proper biopic, like Gandhi. Something like with a big budget. Why not?
I always imagined it as an animation. It's really.
It can, yeah, right. Yeah. I remember we talked about that. Yeah.
I always see it as animation for some strange reason.
Like a Persepolis kind of thing.
Yeah, because it doesn't feel real sometimes. The stories that we.
Yeah. Actually, perfect as an animated film because,
it could be a hybrid. I mean, you could always.
Or a graphic novel.
But then there's no music.
It's okay.
Well, I mean, you could put a CD with it. What was
that?
Yeah,
I turned the page.
Wait, did you just say you put a CD with it?
Yeah, when you hear the tone, turn the page.
Well, I mean, it's been done before. There was actually 2 graphic novels that Kid Koala had done with an album around them, and they ended up turning into stage shows as well with puppets and he animated it essentially, but with puppetry. They're beautiful. He kept the same soundtrack, if I'm not mistaken.
I guess there's many ways of tackling things.
It's a crazy story.
I mean, if you look at the work of Wael
Shawqi. Yeah.
Wael Shawqi, yes.
He came to Bahrain. This is like, it's a really complicated issue. Like this appropriation of like traditions from other places. Even if you're from the region, does it still make it okay? I don't know, you know. So I actually had a lot of problems with Wael's use, like his kind of creative misunderstanding, I guess, if that's a word. Or, I mean, it is a word, it is a term. It's not like a negative thing. It's just this creative pass, I guess, to do things. I think like there's some things about it, like Wael. I don't know if you've seen the performance.
Yeah.
He's done like a number of things. Like he's done stuff with Qawwali music, like the Sufi music from singers from Pakistan, where he had them. He just gave them. Yeah, and he gave them kind of technical art language that the migrant worker construction builders kind of caught, and he gives the Qawwali singers to perform. So it's kind of playing on that, and then there was also the use of like the pearl diving musicians from Bahrain. He made them dress like the 1001 Nights, like the turbans and this really fake Orientalist kind of, and with the backdrop and the language.
It makes you feel really uncomfortable.
I felt really uncomfortable because I saw it being produced, and it's bizarre. And
I saw something similar recently. I think it was on Movie or something. And although I really liked the music, I didn't quite understand why it had to be, someone from America doing it. Like it was set in India, and I just thought, not that I care, but I sort of do. But it's like it's kind of what you were talking about. It's like we need a kind of more local or sort of indigenous interest in this kind of music. Why does someone else have to tell us that we need to take care of it?
Yeah, and
like, it's bound to happen, to be perfectly honest. I mean, there's always this sort of cycle that happens, and we're seeing it in other parts of the world where, we have like the sort of traditional music of like our country or region, and then as we sort of get influenced through like other cultures, television, movies, all that, the generation after that tends to move farther away from it, like, I mean, disco even, so you've got that generation that wants to make, instead of making like, same music as Pearl Divers, I think it's called Fidgety is one of the styles.
Yeah.
So like, instead of making Fidgety, they want to make disco, they want to make rock, they want to make, music like that. And then the generation after that circles back around and they find a way to take those elements and present them in new ways. I mean, one of the best ways this happened right now is with cumbia. Like in South America, like cumbia was, like everybody's grandparents' music, and their parents would listen to it, like when they were kids. Then all of a sudden they discovered Pink Floyd and Black Sabbath and stuff like that. So you've got this whole period of like sort of rockish music that was coming out of South America. But now if you look at like the kids who are making electronic music, they're making electronic cumbia. And it's only a matter of time before this happens in the Arab world. It's already happening in Egypt with like electroshavi music, and it's going to happen here in the Gulf as well. I mean, I would say that our music rhythmically is a lot more complex, but it's going to happen. It's only a matter of time, before it takes off and becomes a thing.
I was going to say that, as a Latin American, I do have, I've seen the other side of that as well, in the sense that it's not like, cumbia was not necessarily a very well-known genre, and I'll give you the example of a very well-known DJ, that his name is Quantic, so he's a British DJ that is actually an incredible musician, and he lived in Colombia for 7 years. And he created an analog studio in Colombia, and he collaborated with so many Colombian musicians of traditional music.
Quantic's audio.
Yeah, Quantic is. I mean, he did an incredible amount of work in Colombia, and also I didn't consider it a cultural disruption, like a cultural. I didn't consider it cultural appropriation in the sense that he worked very closely, and actually he even managed to grow the music scene happening in Colombia. So it's also. I think it's difficult to say that every effort that comes from the outside is necessarily meant to highlight or kind of steer towards that kind of cultural appropriation kind of way. I do think that there are musicians out there that are incredible and they're great in their own right, and just because they come from a particular white nation, if you will, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're there to do that. In his case, for example, there was a very genuine interest in the traditional forms of music that were coming out of the Pacific Ocean of Colombia and the Afro-Colombian rhythms, as well as the Andean rhythms and so on. And he really incorporated that. And to be fair, he managed to highlight, obviously not how many of us really go on Spotify and randomly listen to, traditional music from Venezuela? Like, that doesn't really happen. So you do have sometimes these people that have a lot more exposure that are able to launch those names out, which I think is the case that happened here. So I do think that there is, it's not so much that we're looking, in this case, for example, when I'm giving the Quantic example, I don't think that the musicians were, or the Colombian music was seeking validation from the white man, because we listen to cumbia all the time traditionally, and our parties have this music, and we listen to salsa, so we're not always influenced by the outside. But he did launch our music to an international audience that would have been very difficult for us to do on our own otherwise. So it's a mixed bag for me. There are a bunch of musicians a bunch of DJs actually that are doing that. You have Nicola Cruz, who's half French, half South American. You have El Búho. You have Chancha Via Circuito. Like, there is a whole genre. Yeah, he's amazing. But there is a whole genre of this European, South American breed musicians that are really doing something new.
Part of what made that happen actually was a lot of those musicians actually migrated to Europe. Like in the case of one group from Peru, Dengue Dengue Dengue, they moved to Berlin, and they had all this like fun, like cumbia that they wanted to present on a dance floor. So they basically took it, chopped it up, and added a whole lot more bass to make it more understandable to other people. I think stuff like that it's fun when you can like kind of dig into your own like cultural musical roots and find new ways to present it. Yeah, and as I said, I think it's only a matter of time before that's something that happens here. We're definitely seeing, with the availability for kids to download cracked versions of Ableton and Fruity Loops and stuff, it's so easy to get a hold of software to start making music. Not saying you should download cracked software, but you could. And you could start making music that way.
Maybe, allegedly.
Yeah, allegedly. And it's like allegedly happening in places like South Africa and in Brazil. And so, these are people that grew up with hearing like different types of music from the rest of us. And the electronic music that they're producing as a result is going to be a bit more tied to their roots. It's a really exciting time.
But the key thing that both of you have said is that you already listen to Colombian music, whatever, you listen to it. And you consume it. And until that happens in a more significant way here, then we're going to see a little bit more effort put into these kind of things.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah. And the reason also why I mentioned this particular DJ is because like Quantic was in Dubai, and he's performed here. Nicola Cruz has performed all over. He has
here as well.
His boiler room, he's been here. So my point is that it is a launching pad, and it is an exchange, because a lot of these musicians are also half European, either by mother or they just moved to France, and that kind of that launched their career in that way, and they brought that influence back home. So I think that that's kind of, there is a cultural exchange. Like I said, Quantic's analog studio was very well known for bringing Colombian musicians together. Like even Colombian musicians wouldn't have collaborated with in different genres unless it was for kind of what he had in mind. That he's a producer. So unfortunately, it's also a matter of. I think other than cultural appropriation or that subject, I think it's also a matter of just opportunity and the fact that, obviously it's income and chances to do all these things and how creativity can be hinged by, colonial inferiority and so on. I think there is a lot more in that.
Hassan, I love that version that we did, or they did, Boogie and the orchestra and everyone playing that piece of Marhons that was everyone coming together and playing music and really it was, I think, unplanned. It was unplanned.
It was unplanned. It was the second night we decided to do it, and so we had like this after party after the concert. We're like, why don't we just play together? So we didn't even.
That was one of my favorite pieces actually, and it takes what both Tarik and everyone was talking about was, just. It comes together in that piece, right?
Yeah, that was that piece.
I think it's on YouTube.
Yeah, it's there.
But that is, I mean, that's a collaboration, right? That's like you said, it's impromptu. It was, born out of the musical connection, and I think, a lot of these projects are do lend themselves to that kind of engagement. And I think there is the different varying degrees of sort of sincere engagement, that delineates appropriation from actual, curiosity and from, belonging. And I think that's a very long, and problematized, rightfully so, way of thinking about the work that we do, especially as we become, here we are, we're having a conversation in English. We're outwardly facing for the most part as sort of, representatives or spokespeople or, experts in, kind of bringing to light, these figures and these stories. Here you are, making a short film about, probably like a handful, of films that have been made about, the music scene here, and I think that carries a lot of responsibility to, continuously engage critically with it. It's not a resolved, question. I guess I'm going to throw to the audience as well. If anybody wants to throw it, you don't have to turn your cameras on. You can just shoot us questions in the chat. We had a comment from Gorgio Mardinan.
Yeah, the Quantic. Yeah, that's the one I was talking about. I knew that he came in 2015, I think, to Music Room. I'm a big fan of Quantic.
For those of you that don't know Giorgio, he's a bit of a legend on the local scene out here as well. He's been involved from everything from Deep Crate's Cartel, which I believe were the group that brought out Quantic, to Soul DXB. He's an amazing record collector and DJ in town.
I guess no questions.
No questions.
Have you? Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go back to my little tally before thanks for sharing that. Just in terms of sort of your dream projects, who are whether it's punk, rock, all these different musical kind of influences that you think are either hidden, untold, influences from the brass bands to fascinating stories of I guess other times or hidden kind of musical eras that you would love to see the light of day. Hassan, maybe I'll start with you.
I'm actually at the moment I'm working on one on this project about someone called Halim Al-Dab. I don't know, some people might know who he is, but he was an Egyptian American composer. He's believed to be one of the first people in the world to record sounds and then manipulate the recorded sounds. This was in 1944. And so even before Pierre Schaeffer in Paris did the whole music concrete thing with magnetic tapes, Halim Al-Dab was a student studying agricultural engineering, and he kind of recorded this Zar ritual, this kind of pseudo, kind of spiritual, kind of healing ritual in Egypt, the Said region, and he kind of took it back to the studio, started manipulating, and he wanted to see if the sounds, amplified sounds, would frighten insects, and they would kind of protect crops from insects and from locusts. But then it turned out to be that was one of his first kind of compositions, and it's one of the first electronic music compositions known, today. And I met him in 2015 when he was in his late 90s, in his early 90s, and I've been doing research, so my PhD had something to do with him, and right now I'm working with Savi, this collective in Savi Contemporary.
Savi, really?
Yeah. So I'm working with Savi right now to do this on this really large-scale project where we're publishing this book together, and Rose can have a concert series in Berlin next year. So I mean, these kinds of heroes, this like musical heroes, is something that I'm constantly working with. This is kind of part of what I do. It's part of my practice.
How can we learn more about that?
It'll be announced soon by Savi. Yeah, it'll be. But Halim Al-Dab, I mean, you can just Halim. I just typed his name up, and you can find. So this is from Egypt, from the 1940s onwards. He was doing that contemporary music. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he was a great guy, really important composer. But there's also stuff in the region that's incredible, like music from 1950s, electronic music, 1950s from Iran was also incredible. The stuff they had in the 50s, electronic music, like really, they were like going to Darmstadt in Germany and like studying with Stockhausen, and they were part of that scene. There's a lot of incredible stuff here in the region, but that's just the classical music stuff. I'm not even going to get started on kind of the more informal, like the more vernacular types of music, whether it's folk music or like rock or these variants of stuff. But there's a lot going on, and it just never ends, really.
And Tarik, what have you been listening to, obsessing over?
We spoke recently about a certain compilation of Iranian music from the 60s and 70s called Pomegranates that, I don't know, it found its way into my car a while ago, like 8 months ago, and it takes a lot for an album to stick around in my car for that long. But yeah, definitely that. I've been listening to a lot more stuff that focuses on texture lately. I don't know, my musical world is usually very dance music oriented, just the nature of DJing for the most part. But since the lockdown, everything I've been listening to has become more calming, more things that aren't focused on a dance or a club space, but more of like a listening space. It's been really, really refreshing. My sort of weekly radio show that I do focuses on stuff that's like that. I mean, it's just kind of nice to not be stuck into any one single format, or just being put in a position where I have to make people dance. Just have to play good music. It's kind of nice.
On that note, I mean, thank you for sticking around. We were supposed to go for an hour, and I feel like this is a conversation that can be one of many chapters, just like this documentary that you're going to extend now that we've put that out there into the world.
Yeah. I'm expecting. I'll put my IBAN number below. And funds for that.
I'll set up a GoFundMe after this.
We can get somewhere.
Thank you very much for hosting us.
That was really nice. It was a great conversation. I'm really happy to connect with everyone. And it's refreshing. It's really, I don't know what the word is for it, but it's nice to be able to revisit these projects that were important to us. Give us this new kind of perspective on things that we've done and things that we should be doing in the future. So,
I'm going to try and pull up a link as well of, there's a short documentary that, the digital Saudi sort of era before the opening of cinemas was, was kind of led by, the equivalent of, YouTube shows, and productions that were telling the story of Saudi, and, we're a lot more politically engaged than what we're seeing now, into the sort of the mainstream. And there was a short film called I forgot the name, but it talks about the sort of the Fan al-Shallat in Saudi and how that came to take over, as the sort of the mainstream music sound of Saudi Arabia, and kind of quickly delves into a sort of a very quick recap of the history of music in Saudi, and it just like you were saying, there's just so much, and they're literally just scratching the surface, and you can extrapolate multiple documentaries from every single artist. And I guess the other thing that I just was thinking about as we were talking about this is in reflection vis-a-vis trends that happened in South America and other places, is that we are still in a region that is in the process, very engaged in the process of nation building, and telling its own story, and everything is political, and this idea of of having to manicure a representation or a sound or a particular type of of voice that represents that fits with your narrative is what kind of is forcing a particular, I guess, underrepresentation or direction in what we're seeing. And I think the more that you create, even if, like Saleh was saying, even if it's propaganda or it's Microsoft PowerPoint attempts at telling stories or commissioned projects, I think that also opens up opportunities for people to find out what else is going on in the crevices, and what are these stories that we haven't really engaged with. So on that note, thank you, Tarik, for leading this. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And Tarik, how can we follow? How can we point everyone into your current show and what you're doing with Box Out and a few other things that you're onto?
I'm just gonna drop my Instagram because that's pretty much my main way of communicating with everybody these days. So I'm going to drop that in the chat. It's tarik.omar.music. Pretty straightforward stuff. I do a show out of Nightjar Coffee right now. It's a weekly thing. I've got a couple of guest mixes up on Box Out, on Radio Al Hara, and a few others that have not been announced yet, but will be coming out very, very soon. Big things coming. A lot of fun stuff. So just trying to stay in music at a time when we can all hang out.
Well, thank you for sharing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, you guys are thanking me, but I mean, really, Saleh and Hassan, you guys did an incredible thing, and I'm very thankful that I could help share that with other people.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for rejuvenating it in our minds. It's been 4 years, but I enjoyed this chat. And I think, Hassan, we're due for a coffee that you promised me. Or I promised you, I don't know.
Benny, I don't know who promised to, but somebody owes somebody a coffee.
Yeah, soon. Take care, guys. You have a good night, and see you all soon in the flesh, hopefully. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you.